Welcome to Cup Chat with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Today, join our Birding with Extension team members and guests Irene Liu and Dani Miller as they discuss what to expect from the upcoming renaming of eponymous birds.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It looks like we're live. So first off, I want to thank y'all for joining Cup Chat and Birding with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. So don't forget to put in the comment section where you're tuning in from this morning. So I guess I'm trying to think what we have. So announcements wise this morning, don't forget Birding the Border. Registration is open for that. Other than that, I think, Dani, am I thinking of anything else, or am I missing anything else? I think we're pretty quiet right now.
Yeah,
right before the holiday season.
The end of the year, we wrapped up most everything. So
yes, we're busy. Everyone's busy, so we just decided to give everyone a break. But once again, thank y'all for tuning in this morning. We're going to be talking about a very important topic in the birding community. Our guest this morning is Dr. Irene Liu from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but more importantly, she is actually on the ad hoc English Bird Names Committee. So we're going to talk about what to expect in the next couple of months, or heck, maybe even years.
Yeah, I think that's close.
Next coming years, with changing some of these eponymous bird names. I was just saying before we got on that before all this started, I had never, to my knowledge, I don't think I've ever heard the word eponymous before. And I definitely had to Google it and see how to pronounce it, so I didn't make a complete and total fool of myself. I don't know, had y'all ever heard the word eponymous before? Am I just special?
I heard of it in terms of like a book like Huckleberry Finn, and it was like the eponymous character, or like the eponymous title, and you're like, oh, okay, like the title equals the character name. I think that's how I heard of it.
I was gonna say, y'all are so much smarter than I am.
No, it just was a function of, I feel like maybe it even came up like in the context of Huckleberry Finn or something, where it was in English lit. Like, I feel like that's probably where I heard it first, but I don't know that I've heard it a lot in the context of wildlife or just like species names. Usually hasn't been a word in the conversation.
So maybe I just didn't pay attention in English lit. Maybe it wasn't my science classes. I just didn't pay attention in English lit very well, apparently. Either way, probably not good, but anyway. Okay, so Irene, I guess we'll kick it off. So the idea of changing these eponymous bird names, it has come up in the past, normally on like a case-to-case basis. So why now? Why did we decide that this was the time that these bird names needed to be changed?
Yeah, great question. And thank you again so much, Liz and Dani, for having me on. Really excited to be here. I guess the way to frame that question would be to say, instead of like, why now? I know that the announcement probably came as a surprise to people because it had been really kept under wraps and nobody wanted it to leak. But the reality of it, I'd say, is that it's never not been worked on since like 2019, 2020. I would really categorize it as a continuum of events that led to the announcement being made, instead of the announcement itself kind of considered in isolation, like dropped like a bomb. So just to give you all a brief history, starting, I would set the scene in maybe 2019, but like a lot of the events in 2020 were really, really pivotal. So maybe the stuff that came before was that there had been a proposal submitted to the committee that governs like scientific and English name changes under the society. So just to step back a little bit, the American Ornithological Society is relevant in this whole issue because the governing bodies, like the checklist committees that govern like names for North American and South American species, sit within the society. There are lots of different committees, but they are the ones responsible for keeping like the local checklists. So that's why the society and the committees are like characters in this story. So anybody can submit proposals for name changes. And so there was a proposal submitted in 2019 that proposed to change the name of a grassland bird called McCown's longspur on the basis of the fact that it was named after a person who, was the first Western documenter of that species, but later joined the Confederate Army. And so there were like diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice issues the proposer felt ought to be addressed. And so initially that proposal was rejected on the basis of, stability is more important. And we don't normally change names on these grounds. But the checklist committee did revise its guidelines to start considering the permissibility of changing names, because of harm or exclusion. And then I would say the biggest event that happened afterwards was, the events of Memorial Day 2020, just reminding everybody that was the day George Floyd was killed, as well as Christian Cooper was confronted in Central Park. So many people might not remember that those two events happened on the same day, these like very racially charged events. And so really out of that, just as many other sectors of society had this reckoning about the legacy of like colonialism, racism in their fields, ornithology did too. And I think the most important thing to highlight is that the Bird Names for Birds movement, this grassroots initiative to change the names of birds named after people, came from that, reckoning. And so I would say that kicked off a lot of really intense debates. And I think a lot of people, it became a really charged issue. A lot of people took it really personally. There was a lot of anger on both sides. And where I would say I came in is that I mentioned the society has a lot of different committees. And so I've been a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and sort of just watching the disagreements really become inflamed. Several of my fellow committee members and I decided like we really wanted to, was there any way we could mediate this? Because we were sort of watching this unfold. And so we wanted to learn about the issue ourselves, not being taxonomists, not knowing too much about the issue. And I will credit Dr. Drew Lanham here. He's a professor at Clemson University. And I was talking with him about a different project, and he had suggested holding a public forum without knee-jerk reaction, where people could openly discuss this and listen to each other and have space for airing their perspectives. And so we were really inspired by that idea. And we started contacting, leading stakeholders across the birding and ornithological community to talk about their perspectives. And to cut the story short, basically that led to this public forum called the Community Congress in 2021. And then after that Congress, which again, it was like a Zoom webinar with a lot of people, on a panel talking about their perspectives from many different communities of bird users. Then the American Ornithological Society convened an ad hoc English bird names committee, which started meeting in 2022. And then that was the committee that wrote the recommendations that were then voted on in summer 2023. So that's a really long, winded way of saying like there's a whole timeline of events that led to the announcement that was made public in November.
Well, it is a very, obviously it's a very complicated topic in and of itself. So yes, it deserves a very long explanation. But I have a quick question, and then Dani, I'll let you go. So before this, maybe you don't know the answer to this. Do you know how often bird name changes were submitted? It doesn't seem like, other than if you had, a species that would split, there was generally not really a reason to rename birds. Is that correct?
No, I think currently there are lots of bird name changes happening, and there is a yearly process by which proposals are submitted and considered, and revisions to the checklist are published. But the important thing to know is that those name changes are all based off of taxonomic revisions and scientific data. So I would say bird name changes are not an infrequent thing at all. Every year, you have that discussion about the new names that get pushed out, revised names or names that happen because the species is split into two, and then you need a new name for one of the daughter species or for both of them.
Right.
Yeah.
But instead of a large chunk, it's a handful here, a handful there every year.
Yeah. But it's important to say that this is not going to be a huge chunk all at once. I think one of the considerations that people are really aware of is that, you don't want to destabilize a system with too many name changes at once. So, and I think just the nature of being very careful in the process is going to mean that this process, even though the large scale name change was announced, the names themselves will be changing very gradually over a very long period of time. So it's certainly not months, as you said at the beginning.
Yeah, I have a question about, so, it sounds like there's a lot of groundwork laid up to the ad hoc English Bird Names Committee coming together. Once the committee was put together, what were the specific factors that ultimately led to kind of the decision to kind of make this large scale change? And what were the specific factors that played into that? Can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, what went into the change. I can talk. I think the best way to answer that question is to describe sort of how we worked, and maybe that's how we came to the discussion. So the committee was very specifically composed of individuals from diverse, demographic as well as professional backgrounds. And so, I personally am super grateful to have been a part of it because I learned so much from everybody who again contributed different types of expertise. And so, at first, so the charge was officially to develop a process to, deal with quote harmful and exclusionary names. And so, we were not in the process about to say this name will change to this name, that's in the future. But it was a really big picture question to consider. And so a lot of the conversations were really thoughtful discussions about, can you draw a line at different categories of names? How does somebody come up with categories of names? What is a framework? What are some things that we know would need to be in this process? For example, public engagement, I think people were pretty clear on, so it was kind of all nebulous at one point. I would say that for me, one of the linchpins, one of the most important meetings was when we actually consulted with a different taxonomic society. We had a meeting with the communications director of the Entomological Society of America, and they've been struggling with this issue too, maybe from a slightly different angle, but they changed the name of gypsy moth that was widely publicized in 2022. So they had sort of gone ahead of us in terms of, well, that's not true. We had changed, thick-billed longspur, but it just was solidarity with other, taxonomic fields that were kind of trying to work this thing through as well. And they'd also changed Asian giant hornet / murder hornet, to northern giant hornet. So, they're also dealing with names that have pejorative or discriminatory language that they're trying to move away from. And so basically listening to his reporting of the lessons learned from that society, I think, started to gel for us a possible framework that we could move forward with. And so maybe one thing that I can talk about right now is that first of our 3 recommendations, which was that we recommended changing all names that are directly named after people. And so, as I mentioned, that was that was put together through many long discussions. But I think what we and people, lots of people that I've heard from who've been, kind of hearing the recommendations, a totally understandable, valid first reaction is well, hang on a second, you had a charge to deal with harmful and exclusionary names, certainly Scott and Townsend, those are the worst offenders. Why are we getting rid of Wilson and Stellar and people who made outstanding ornithological contributions as well? And I totally respect that. And I would actually encourage folks to read all of the thought that we lay out in the recommendations. But the upshot is that we considered what it would take to maybe do things on a case by case basis, which seems to be that silver bullet between minimizing disruption and like really getting to the worst of the worst offenders. But it just proved impossible to try to draw the line, because for many different reasons. And then also when we were trying to come up with an equitable process to decide who's like worthy of keeping their names and whose names ought to be discarded, you'd have to come up with a committee of people to make that direct decision. How might you go about doing that? You'd have to come up with a list of criteria by which to judge people's deeds, ornithological contributions. You'd have to have a standardized process to collect as much information as you can to have a comprehensive portrait of that individual. And you'd have to account for the fact that there are multiple narratives of history and that, AOS is like a multinational organization. And so all of it together really felt like this would be a path toward really endless debates about something that was quite different from bird conservation and natural history and public engagement, in such a way that we ultimately actually felt that the case-by-case basis would be infeasible just to execute. There wasn't any conversation that I was in where it kind of resolved in terms of how do you decide who gets to keep their name and who's, again, worthy of the namesake. And so to move away from those value judgments, or to make these morality decisions, basically, we said we think it's better to move away from this practice altogether. Maybe the question is not who gets to keep their name, but which kinds of practices might be better to move on from altogether. So that would be the main decision. And it looks like I might have some time to talk about the rationale for the other recommendations later in this conversation.
So I realized, before we even kicked things off, there's a lot of things that are still unknown with some of the steps moving forward. We know they're probably going to change and evolve over the next coming years, months. But so just sort of the basis. So now that the decision has been made, what are some of the next steps that you can speak to that? So people that, I'm sure everyone is definitely wondering what is going to happen, how this is all going to sort of go down. So can you just speak to that a little bit as to what people can expect?
Sure. And yeah, I want to be clear here that I'm on the group that wrote the recommendations, and when AOS adopted these, the leadership it's my understanding that the leadership is moving forward with implementing, but it may not 100% reflect what we recommended for many, many different reasons. But what to expect is that I do believe that they're moving forward with the second recommendation, which was to create a new standing committee empowered to be in charge of common English bird names. And so I know that AOS, the leadership, has received a lot of enthusiastic offers from people who would like to be on that committee. And they're being really deliberate about putting together a really equitable, inclusive process. So I think that's the next step to come. And again, like these are all new processes. So I think people are being really cautious about, how to move forward with lots of room for, iteration as things are going forward. So that's one of the next steps, that a committee will be formed of people who reflect like the breadth of bird name users and the birding and ornithological community. And then that committee would likely be tasked with coming up with the engagement process, or a public engagement process that would involve the public in selecting new names. So that's our third recommendation.
Yeah, I did have I mean, and I know probably that's quite a bit in the future, but on the committee that you were on, where you were making these recommendations, was there any discussion or more tangible framework for public engagement in the future when you were talking about the recommendations?
Yeah. What we put forth was just a model, like it was a suggestion for how it might look. And again, free of like personnel capacity, bandwidth considerations, because this will be a heavy lift if we're going to have the engagement that would be ideal. So what we had proposed was some sort of AOS hosted platform with functionalities. I mean, almost a little bit like Facebook and Reddit, where like we would solicit, we would say, hey, this bird name is up for changing. Here's a little bit of information about it. It's taxonomic history, it's natural history. And then we would invite, ideas for potential replacement names from the public. As well as other information they might have, like, other knowledge about the species, information from outside a Western perspective. And then the Reddit part, or the Facebook poll part might be where, people could submit names and people could vote or express support for different names. Like that would be really cool, because then you'd have a lot of investment and, participation in how this bird's name might turn to, or how it might evolve. So that would be the what we had put down in the recommendations. And again, not sure how closely reality will match that. But I think the important takeaway from that is, all of this is in service of creating a more inclusive and welcoming birding community. Like that, it was super important to have that public involvement so that these changes wouldn't be arbitrary, wouldn't be performative, because like keeping in mind the real point of this is to increase in participation and investment in birding and in the natural world, because we're trying to improve these birds' conservation outlooks.
So basically, I realize this is not, set in stone like you just said, but so basically y'all's recommendation is that it will be basically based on public decision as to what the bird's name will be changed to, is what y'all recommended. Now, what actually happens in the future, we don't really know. Am I understanding you correctly?
Not quite. We definitely didn't want public opinion to dictate the next name. So I suppose the way to balance that would be the public would
weigh
in. They would propose names, and then the standing committee would maybe have a short list and then go back to the public, for example, for that second round. But they would have the authority, and in close consultation with the taxonomic committees, who are the experts at this, for scientific names and English names, to make the final decision. No. Like I think everybody was, the classic, don't do the birdie big bird face, like that's the one that's always tossed around. So it would not be up to the public to just have a majority vote. There would,
but they do have they do have a say in what it could be. They just won't necessarily have the final say as to what it will be.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, Dani, I feel like we're covering a lot of topics really well, and I'm really loving this. I guess so. After the name has been selected, how long? I'm assuming it's not just going to be, Scott's Oriole goes from Scott's Oriole to whatever its new name is. It's not just a on-off switch. That there will be a period of time of acclimation period, because I know a lot of us have grown up knowing a bird by a certain name, and then that bird is now known by something else. So there will be a learning acclimation period. Is that correct? There will be an acclimation period where those common names, the original common name, will be associated with that new common name. Is that what we can expect?
Yeah, that's my understanding comes from my work at the lab of ornithology, which manages Merlin and lots of like well-known, well-loved tools. And so that was a discussion within that context where the people involved, the project leaders, were saying like, we can make that a soft landing, absolutely, so that people don't have like a really hard transition. And that's certainly like, that's a diversity inclusion consideration, if people's livelihoods depend on knowing these names, and you want to make it as smooth and easy a transition. So it might depend on the tools, the field guides, it will come down to like, I think, publishers, but I think generally the sentiment is absolutely, we want this to be, we don't want there to be any barriers to relearning birds. And maybe, whatever whatever tools or aids that come out of this set of revisions can be used for all types of bird name revisions. Because I think my impression right now is that like the checklist revisions will get pushed out, and maybe there's not that much right now for existing name changes that people have to get used to. I'm not as sure about that, but if there's anything that we can do for this set of name changes that can just help all sorts of learning about all sorts of name changes.
Yeah, I think the opportunity here to potentially set a precedent for a lot of these different things is really an amazing kind of like opportunity that it maybe won't even come around again for quite some time, in the natural resources kind of world. So
yeah, I like to think about the opportunity of it. That's what really excites me.
So do we know, because and this is what I've heard, Dani, I don't know if you heard the same thing, but I've heard that basically they're going to be changing these bird names in like groups of like 60. Is that correct? Or is that just one of those like rumor mill type things? Do you even know if that's true or not?
Yeah. What I can say to that is the committee recommended changing, all the names that are directly named after people. And so that was just like, we went straight down the North American and South American checklists, and as well as 3 other names with culturally, unsuitable references. So that was like, we had big kind of pool of names. But what AOS, the society, is moving forward with is about 70 to 80 names. So out of that big pool of names, about 70 or 80 of these birds are species that occur predominantly in the US and Canada. And so there are a couple reasons why they narrowed that set. One is that, I think these are the geographic areas where I think there's the most buy-in and familiarity with the rationale for changing these names. And the corollary is, we don't want any adverse diversity, equity, inclusion, justice consequences by imposing a unilateral decision without consulting like neotropical ornithologists on this. Like, yes, true, like AOS's jurisdiction is this geographic region, but obviously you want to do this in close consultation and coordination with people from those geographic areas. So AOS chose to say, like, yes, there is technically this entire pool of names, but let's start with this geographic region where it's probably going to be the most feasible and the least like friction again with the very objectives that we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah, and I feel like that'll help you. Okay, I was just going to say that'll help kind of fine tune those processes too, as well, to start with kind of that specific subset, if you will, and figure out, all we've talked about in terms of what it's going to look like as a timeline, as a process to rename each of these birds.
And even before then, there has been a pilot process. Like we recommended one, and I'm pretty sure they're going to go through with like fewer than 10 species to iron out lots of different technical considerations that must be incorporated. I mean, so like you can do this wrong. You can do it in a way that actually has adverse consequences for like conservation and science and everything. Like there are so many things to consider. This thing is justifiably a very complex process. So people are considering which maybe 10 species to go forth with, and again to set up a committee, to kind of establish any processes and workflows. And so 70 to 80 is like definitely too much to try that with. So they wanted to do just a very small sample of species that might represent different considerations. Like this species is a vagrant. This species has no known historic names. These ones do. These ones do represent like the worst offenders. So lots of different kind of axes of considerations would go into that pilot process.
So I guess one thing we hadn't really covered. So what, because you had mentioned sort of what was the word that you used? Not distribution, but like the area that these bird names are going to change. So where is AOS's jurisdiction at?
Currently, it's the North American Classification Committee is North America and outlying islands. Middle America counts as part of North America, and then the South American Checklist Committee. So currently those are both housed under AOS.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So basically names will be changing in basically like North America and South America, correct?
Yeah, I would
That's
consider hemispheric
okay.
is probably the
Hemispheric.
easiest way
Okay.
to think about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess my final question to you is, because I feel like we could talk on this for like another like 30 to 40 minutes. But I'm not going to hold you hostage that long. So I guess my final question to you is there any questions that we did not ask that you want people to know about, or any information you want them to know?
Yeah. I really encourage people to read the recommendations. I think there have been again, a lot of people have reacted with maybe surprise, a little bit like, positive or negative surprise at, why did we say this? Why did we say this? And generally I've found that, looking at the recommendations where we made sure to lay out, we showed our work, we showed our homework, basically, that provides a really good springboard for discussion with people that I've had. So, really happy to have conversation, and encourage everybody and invite everybody to read, like the rationales that we lay out.
And you shared, I was gonna say you shared a link with me. So I'm gonna put that, once we wrap up, I'm gonna put that in the chat. That has all the information you can want. If people want to keep up with this, where can they go to get the latest news as to what's going on with all of this?
Oh, that's a really good question. I am not, I think, so the English Bird Names Project, which is the parent, folder of where the recommendations are, that probably will be the best like official news source. I'll admit I'm not on social media anymore, so I'm not quite sure. I don't think that they would really do too many live updates, because I know that they're in the trenches right now. The leadership is in the trenches.
I don't doubt that one bit.
But yeah, the English Bird Names Project is a really good hub for not just the recommendations, but the official statement by AOS Council, which was the body that voted on adopting the recommendations. So they have their own statement, and then there's an FAQ section there too. So I would consider that a little bit of a hub of information that people can find.
Gotcha. Well, luckily the birding community is small enough that I'm sure if they check the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's page, Audubon's page, I'm sure all of those guys will be up to date as well with all the information. Because like we said, this is a big change that's coming to the birding community. And everybody just wants everyone to feel, they don't want to feel surprised by it. They want to, we all want to share as much information as we possibly can.
Absolutely. Transparency is
yes.
so important here. Like that's a huge objective of this. Yeah.
Yes. But okay. Well, yep. So we're going to wrap this up. Like I said, I feel like we could talk for another like 30 to 40 minutes on this easy. But we will turn y'all loose for the day. Irene, we greatly appreciate you coming on to talk about this. We will have to have you back on in the future with a little update. But otherwise, again, I hope everyone has an absolutely fantastic day, and thank y'all so much for tuning in, and we will see y'all in the future down the road. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, that was awesome, Irene. Thanks.